The rain hammered against the windows of Rosewood Cafe like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Inside, the warm amber glow of Edison bulbs cast dancing shadows across worn wooden tables, creating the kind of atmosphere that whispered promises of new beginnings. But for Sarah Mitchell, the 34-year-old CEO of Tech Vision Industries, every shadow seemed to mock her deepest fears. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the sleek chrome wheels of her custom-built wheelchair. Positioned strategically at table 7, the corner booth she'd specifically requested. Corner tables were safer, easier to navigate, harder for people to stare from all angles. The burgundy leather jacket she'd chosen that morning suddenly felt too formal, too much like armor she was trying to wear into battle. A battle she wasn't sure she could win. 3 years. 3 years since the accident that had stolen not just her ability to walk, but seemingly her ability to believe that someone could love all of her. The merger proposal she'd closed that rainy Tuesday morning had been worth $47 million. The celebration dinner was supposed to be a triumph. Instead, a drunk driver running a red light had turned her world upside down in the space of a heartbeat. The physical therapy had been grueling, but the emotional recovery? That was a mountain she was still climbing, one painful step at a time. Her best friend Emma had set up this blind date despite Sarah's protests. "You can't hide behind spreadsheets and board meetings forever," Emma had said with that stubborn love that only true friends possess. "David Thompson is different. He's kind, genuine, and he's raising his daughter alone. He understands responsibility, Sarah. He understands that life isn't always picture perfect." Now, sitting in this cafe that smelled of cinnamon and hope, Sarah wondered if Emma had mentioned the wheelchair. The familiar knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach as she watched the door, simultaneously praying he would show up and hoping he wouldn't. Each time the bell above the entrance chimed, her heart performed a little dance of terror and anticipation. The accident hadn't just changed her physically. It had rewrought her entire relationship with the world. She'd built Tech Vision from nothing, commanding boardrooms filled with men who initially doubted her capabilities. She'd learned to be fierce, uncompromising, brilliant. But dating required a different kind of vulnerability, one that her wheelchair seemed to magnify tenfold. Every introduction became an explanation. Every first glance carried the weight of judgment. Every relationship had ended with someone who claimed they couldn't handle her reality. Her phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Stop overthinking. You're amazing exactly as you are. Give this a chance." Sarah smiled despite her nerves. Emma had been her rock through everything. The endless physical therapy sessions, the nights when the pain was unbearable, the moments when she'd questioned whether building an empire was worth it if she'd end up ruling it alone. Emma had never let her sink into the darkness that threatened to consume her in those first months after the accident. The cafe door chimed again, and this time, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A man entered, shaking rain from his dark hair, scanning the room with gentle brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. David Thompson was exactly as Emma had described, tall without being imposing, with the kind of smile that crinkled at the corners and suggested he laughed often. He wore a simple navy sweater and jeans, the uniform of someone who'd learned that comfort and authenticity mattered more than impressing anyone. But it was what happened next that made Sarah's heart skip in a way she hadn't felt in years. David's eyes found hers across the crowded cafe, and instead of the microscopic pause she'd grown accustomed to, that split second where people registered the wheelchair and recalibrated their expectations, he simply smiled. Not the careful, pitying smile she'd learned to dread, but a genuine expression of recognition and warmth. He walked toward her table with unhurried confidence, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah felt like she might remember what it was like to be seen as a woman first, everything else second. David approached table 7 with the careful composure of a man who understood that first impressions could either build bridges or create walls. But as he drew closer to Sarah Mitchell, he realized that Emma's description hadn't done her justice. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with conventional beauty, and everything to do with the quiet strength that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. Her green eyes held depths that spoke of battles fought and won, and when she smiled, really smiled, it transformed her entire face. "Sarah?" he asked, extending his hand with genuine warmth. "I'm David. Emma's told me so much about you that I feel like I already know your coffee order." The laugh that escaped Sarah's lips was musical and genuine, washing away the tension she'd been carrying like a tide pulling back from the shore. "Let me guess. She told you I'm a control freak who color codes her calendar and drinks her coffee black because sugar is for people who have time for sweetness?" "Close," David grinned, settling into the chair across from her with an ease that surprised them both. "She said you drink your coffee like your business deals, strong, straightforward, and with no room for anything that doesn't belong." As he removed his jacket, Sarah noticed the small details that spoke volumes about who David Thompson was. The slight fraying at the cuffs of his sweater suggested a man who valued comfort over fashion. His hands bore the subtle calluses of someone who worked with them, and there was a small scar along his knuckle that looked like it came from a childhood adventure gone slightly wrong. But it was the way he moved, with the measured grace of someone accustomed to being careful, gentle. That made Sarah lean forward slightly. The conversation began like most first dates, with the careful exchange of biographical information. David owned a small construction company that specialized in making homes accessible for people with disabilities. It wasn't lucrative work, he admitted, but it was meaningful. His eyes lit up when he talked about the projects, ramps built with architectural beauty in mind, bathrooms designed for dignity and independence, kitchens lowered without sacrificing style. "I got into it after my wife." David paused, his fingers unconsciously turning a thin gold band he still wore on his right hand. "After Jessica got sick. Multiple sclerosis. The progression was fast, and suddenly our home became a prison instead of a sanctuary. I learned that accessibility isn't just about function, it's about preserving dignity." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. She'd expected the usual awkward dance around her disability, the careful avoidance or the overly eager questions. Instead, David spoke about accessibility with the reverence of someone who understood that mobility was about more than movement. It was about freedom. "She passed 2 years ago," David continued, his voice steady but soft, "and I've been raising our daughter Lily alone since then. She's 8 and she's—" He pulled out his phone, showing a picture of a girl with Jessica's blonde hair and David's warm brown eyes, caught mid-laugh on a swing set. "She's everything good about both of us." Sarah studied the photo, seeing the way David's face transformed when he looked at his daughter. There was a tenderness there that spoke of bedtime stories and scraped knees kissed better, of a man who'd learned to braid hair and navigate the complex social dynamics of third-grade friendships. "Emma mentioned you built Tech Vision from scratch," David said, carefully putting his phone away. "That takes incredible vision and determination." "Or incredible stubbornness," Sarah replied with a self-deprecating smile. "I started the company because I was tired of being the only woman in boardrooms who had to prove she belonged there. Technology should make life better for everyone, not just the people who already have advantages." As Sarah spoke about her work, the algorithms that improved accessibility features, the partnerships with nonprofits, the scholarship program for underrepresented students in tech, David found himself captivated not just by her intelligence, but by the passion that animated her words. This wasn't someone who'd stumbled into success. This was someone who'd carved it out with intention and purpose. The cafe around them gradually emptied, as afternoon melted into evening, but neither seemed to notice. They talked about everything and nothing. Favorite books, the challenge of finding good pizza in a city full of trendy restaurants, the way rain sounded different depending on whether you were inside looking out or outside looking for shelter. It was Sarah who first mentioned the accident, almost casually, while describing why she'd moved her company's headquarters to a single-story building. "After my accident, I realized how many assumptions we make about spaces and the people who use them. Architecture is supposed to serve humanity, not the other way around," David nodded. And Sarah braced herself for the inevitable questions or the careful shift in conversation that usually followed her disclosure. Instead, David simply said, "That must have been a profound teacher, even if it was a harsh one." The simplicity of his response, the way he acknowledged her experience without making it the center of conversation, made Sarah feel something she'd almost forgotten was possible. Normal. Not inspirational or tragic or brave, just normal. As the evening stretched on, both Sarah and David began to recognize something rare was happening between them. The conversation flowed like water, finding its natural course, easy and inevitable. They discovered shared values buried beneath different life experiences, common dreams dressed in different details. But beneath the growing connection, both carried the weight of their individual fears and the question that hung unspoken in the air. Could two people who'd been broken by life find a way to be whole together? 3 weeks had passed since that first coffee date, and what started as careful friendship had bloomed into something neither Sarah nor David had expected. They'd met 6 more times, twice for coffee, once for lunch at a food truck festival where David proved surprisingly adventurous with Sarah's recommendation of Korean-Mexican fusion, twice for walks through Riverside Park, where Sarah's wheelchair navigated the smooth paths with ease, and once for a cooking class that ended with them laughing over a spectacularly failed soufflé. Each encounter had peeled back another layer of the careful armor they'd both built around their hearts. Sarah discovered that David sang unconsciously while he worked, that he still wrote his daughter love notes for her lunchbox every single day, and that he had an inexplicable fear of butterflies that dated back to a childhood incident involving a butterfly house and what he dramatically referred to as the Great Monarch Ambush of 1998. David learned that Sarah spoke 3 languages fluently, that she'd been a competitive swimmer before the accident, and that she kept a secret stash of romance novels hidden behind the business biographies on her bookshelf. Tonight was different. Tonight, David had invited Sarah to his home for dinner, the first time either of them had brought the other into their private sanctuary. As Sarah's adapted Honda pulled into the driveway of the modest craftsman-style house, she felt her familiar pre-date anxiety mixing with something deeper, the fear of meeting Lily. Children, Sarah had learned, were often more honest in their reactions than adults. They stared openly, asked direct questions, and hadn't yet learned the social graces that masked discomfort. She'd had encounters with children since her accident that ranged from innocent curiosity to outright pointing and whispering. The thought of potentially seeing disappointment or fear in the eyes of someone so important to David made her stomach clench. The front door opened before she could even ring the bell, revealing David in an apron that declared "World's Okayest Cook" in bold letters. Behind him, peeking around his legs with the shy boldness that only 8-year-olds possess, was Lily. She was smaller than Sarah had expected, with her father's warm eyes and her mother's delicate features. Her blonde hair was pulled back in what David had clearly attempted as a French braid, but looked more like an abstract art project. She wore a purple dress with grass stains on the knees and unicorn socks that had seen better days. "Lily, this is Sarah," David said gently, his hand resting protectively on his daughter's shoulder. "Sarah, meet the most important person in my world." For a moment, Lily just stared, and Sarah braced herself for the inevitable questions about the wheelchair. Instead, Lily stepped forward with the kind of directness that only children possess and said, "Dad told me you're super smart and that you run a whole company. That's really cool. Also, I like your hair. It's shiny." Sarah's carefully prepared explanations dissolved into surprised laughter. "Thank you, Lily. Your dad told me you're really good at art and that you know more about dinosaurs than most paleontologists. Do you want to see my Triceratops drawing? I made it yesterday and Dad put it on the refrigerator. But he puts everything on the refrigerator, so that's not really special. But I think it's pretty good anyway." The words tumbled out in the rapid-fire way of children who have important things to say and limited patience for adult conversation pace. Before Sarah could respond, Lily had grabbed her hand and was leading her toward the kitchen, chattering about prehistoric herbivores and the superiority of 3-horned dinosaurs over the overrated T-Rex. David followed behind them, watching with wonder as his daughter, who'd been shy around every woman he'd introduced since Jessica's death, immediately adopted Sarah into her world with the enthusiasm she usually reserved. For new art supplies or trips to the Natural History Museum, the house itself told the story of a father learning to raise a daughter alone. The decor was an interesting mixture of David's practical masculinity and Lily's explosion of color and creativity. Artwork covered every available surface, not just Lily's, but professional pieces that spoke of Jessica's influence and David's appreciation for beauty. The kitchen was clearly the heart of the home, with a large island that bore the scars of countless cooking experiments and homework sessions. Dinner was spaghetti and meatballs, which Lily informed Sarah was their fancy meal because it required actual cooking rather than microwaving. As they ate, Sarah found herself drawn into the easy rhythm of their family dynamic. Lily dominated the conversation with stories about her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who apparently had very strong opinions about proper pencil grip and the appropriate volume for indoor voices. David provided gentle guidance and translation when Lily's 8-year-old logic took particularly creative leaps. "Sarah," Lily said suddenly, twirling spaghetti with the concentration of a surgeon, "why do you use a wheelchair? Did you hurt your legs?" The question hung in the air, and Sarah felt David tense slightly beside her. This was the moment she'd been dreading, not because of Lily's curiosity, but because she'd seen too many children's faces change from interest to pity once they understood her situation. "I was in a car accident," Sarah said simply, choosing honesty over elaborate explanation. "My legs were hurt badly, so now I use my wheelchair to get around. It's actually pretty cool. I can go really fast, and I never have to worry about my feet hurting from walking too much." Lily considered this with the seriousness of a philosopher contemplating the universe. Then she asked, "Can I try it sometime? It looks fun." The innocence of the question, the complete absence of pity or awkwardness, hit Sarah like a physical blow. For 3 years, she'd armored herself against reactions, the careful sympathy, the awkward avoidance, the well-meaning but misguided inspiration porn. Lily's matter-of-fact acceptance and genuine curiosity felt like sunlight breaking through clouds she'd forgotten were there. "Maybe someday," Sarah said, her voice slightly husky. "Though you might find it's harder to control than it looks." After dinner, Lily disappeared to her room and returned with an armload of books, settling herself cross-legged on the living room floor near Sarah's wheelchair. "Will you read with me? Dad's okay at voices, but he can't do the princess voice right. And this story has 3 princesses." As Sarah found herself reading The Paper Bag Princess with dramatic flair, while Lily giggled at her interpretation of the dragon's voice, she caught David watching them with an expression she couldn't quite name. It was tender and surprised, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. For the first time since her accident, Sarah allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to belong somewhere again. Not as a guest or a visitor, but as someone essential to the daily rhythm of love and life. The evening felt like the first page of a story she'd never dared to write. The months that followed that first dinner became a careful dance of building something neither Sarah nor David had expected to find again. Their relationship deepened with the gradual patience of seasons changing, each shared moment adding another thread to a tapestry that was becoming beautiful in its complexity. Sarah found herself experiencing firsts she'd thought were behind her forever. The first time David kissed her was on a Tuesday evening in October, as they sat on his back porch watching Lily chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. It was gentle and questioning, his hand cupping her face as if she were something precious. When they broke apart, she realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being wanted exactly as she was. Lily had become an unexpected bridge between them, her 8-year-old wisdom cutting through adult complications with startling clarity. She'd started calling Sarah's visits family time, and had begun including her in the elaborate fantasy games that filled their Saturday mornings. Sarah discovered she had a talent for playing the role of various mythical creatures, much to Lily's delight and David's amused amazement. But it was the quiet moments that revealed the depth of what was growing between them. The evening, Sarah worked late at David's kitchen table, managing a crisis at Tech Vision, while he helped Lily with homework at the other end. The morning she arrived early to find David making pancakes in the shape of dinosaurs, flour in his hair, and patience in his voice as he answered Lily's endless questions about brontosaurus digestive systems. The afternoon, she taught Lily basic coding principles, watching David's daughter's eyes light up as she made a simple animation come to life on the screen. Sarah's own transformation surprised her most of all. The hypervigilance she'd carried since the accident, the constant scanning for judgment, the armor of professional achievement, the assumption that she had to prove her worth in every interaction, began to soften in the safety of David's presence. She started wearing her hair down more often. She laughed at his terrible dad jokes. She let him see her on the difficult days when phantom pain made her short-tempered and frustrated. David was learning too. Learning that loving Sarah meant understanding that some days were harder than others. That accessibility wasn't just about ramps and doorways, but about the subtle ways the world could exclude or include. He started noticing things he'd never seen before. Restaurants with steps but no ramps, parking spaces blocked by careless drivers, the way some people looked through Sarah rather than at her. His protective instincts, honed by years of single fatherhood, expanded to encompass her in ways both tender and fierce. The first night Sarah stayed over, Lily had insisted on a proper sleepover complete with popcorn, braided hair and ghost stories told by flashlight. Sarah had worried about the logistics, her chair, her nighttime routine, the vulnerability of being in someone else's space. Instead, she'd found David had quietly made accommodations without making them feel like accommodations. Extra towels placed within easy reach, a bedside table moved for better accessibility. Little considerations that spoke of thoughtfulness rather than pity. But love, as Sarah and David were rediscovering, wasn't just about the beautiful moments. It was about the day Sarah had a panic attack in the grocery store when a careless shopper knocked into her chair, sending her spinning into a display. David had found her in the parking lot afterward, shaking with a mixture of rage and embarrassment, and had simply held her until the storm passed. No false reassurance, no minimizing her feelings, just presence. It was about the evening David broke down while helping Lily with a school project about family trees, overwhelmed by guilt that he was moving forward when Jessica couldn't. Sarah had listened without judgment as he voiced his fears about betraying his late wife's memory, about whether loving someone new meant loving Jessica less. "Love isn't a finite resource," Sarah had said quietly, her hand covering his. "Lily having a mother didn't make your love for her smaller. Jessica loving you both didn't diminish her capacity to love others. The heart doesn't subtract, David. It multiplies." Spring arrived early that year, and with it came Sarah's most vulnerable revelation yet. She'd been a competitive swimmer before the accident. Not Olympic level, but regional championships, college scholarships, the kind of talent that had defined her identity for years. The accident had taken not just her legs, but her relationship with the water that had been her first love. David had found her one evening staring at a flyer for adaptive swimming programs, her face a map of longing and fear. Without saying anything, he'd made calls, found a program, arranged for an assessment. The first time she'd lowered herself into the pool, she'd cried. The second time, she'd floated. The third time, she'd remembered that she was still fast, still graceful, still herself, just in a different way. Lily had been there for her first real swim, cheering from the pool deck as Sarah cut through the water with the kind of joy that had been missing from her life for too long. "You're like a mermaid," Lily had shouted and Sarah had laughed, water streaming from her face, feeling more like herself than she had in years. But even as their love deepened, both Sarah and David carried the weight of unspoken questions. What did forever look like when both had already lost their first version of it? How did you blend a family when one member was still grieving? Could love that felt this right actually last? Or were they setting themselves up for another kind of heartbreak? The questions followed them into the growing intimacy of their relationship, creating small shadows even in their brightest moments. Neither spoke them aloud, but both felt the tremor of uncertainty that accompanies any leap of faith. Love, they were learning, required not just open hearts, but extraordinary courage. The crisis came on a Thursday morning in late spring, arriving with the devastating swiftness that life sometimes uses to test the strength of what we've built. Sarah was in her office reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant knocked with the kind of expression that precedes bad news. David was calling from the hospital. Lily had collapsed at school during recess, unconscious, unresponsive. The drive to Children's Medical Center passed in a blur of traffic lights and mounting panic. Sarah's hands gripped her car's steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios while her heart hammered against her ribcage. She'd found a place in this small family that had become more precious to her than her company, her achievements, her carefully constructed independent life. The thought of losing Lily, of watching David lose his daughter, felt like staring into an abyss. She found David in the pediatric intensive care unit waiting room, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. His usually warm brown eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his hands shaking as he tried to manage phone calls to family members and insurance companies. When he saw Sarah, his composure finally cracked. "They don't know what's wrong," he said, his voice breaking. She was fine at breakfast. She was laughing about some joke her friend told her. And then, he couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah transferred from her chair to the hospital seat beside him, taking his hands in hers. They were ice-cold despite the warmth of the spring day. Around them, the waiting room held its own particular kind of suspended time. Families caught between hope and devastation, love and loss, the terrible patience that hospitals demand. The hours stretched into days. Tests were run. Blood work, MRIs, consultations with specialists who spoke in careful clinical language that revealed nothing while promising everything would be done. David barely left Lily's bedside, maintaining the kind of vigil that only parents understand, as if his presence alone could anchor her to the world. Sarah found herself navigating a role she'd never inhabited before. Not quite parent, not quite outsider, but something in between that had no clear definition. She managed the practical details, bringing David changes of clothes, coordinating with his foreman to handle work emergencies, fielding calls from well-meaning friends and family. She sat with Lily when David forced himself to go home and shower, reading aloud from the stack of books she'd brought, maintaining a stream of gentle conversation on the chance that Lily could hear her. It was during one of these bedside vigils that Dr. Martinez, the pediatric neurologist, finally had answers. Lily had a rare but treatable condition, a form of epilepsy that could manifest in ways that mimicked more serious problems. With the right medication and monitoring, she could live a completely normal life. The collapse had been frightening but wasn't life-threatening. The relief was overwhelming, but it was followed by something Sarah hadn't expected: David's withdrawal. As Lily recovered and regained her characteristic chatter, as the crisis passed and normal life resumed, David became increasingly distant. He was polite, grateful for Sarah's help during the emergency, but the easy intimacy they'd built began to feel strained. Sarah recognized the signs. She'd experienced her own version after the accident, the way trauma could make you question everything you'd built your life around. But understanding didn't make it hurt less when David's texts became shorter, when dinner invitations became less frequent, when he seemed to be pulling away just when she'd learned how much she needed him. The confrontation came 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening when Sarah arrived for what had become their traditional weekly dinner, to find David sitting on his front porch, clearly waiting for her. Lily was at a sleepover, and the house behind him was dark. "We need to talk," he said, and Sarah felt her heart begin its familiar dance of anxiety and dread. They sat on the porch steps, the space between them feeling like a canyon despite being mere inches. David stared at his hands as he spoke, unable to meet her eyes. "When Lily collapsed," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I realized something I'd been trying not to think about. If I lost her," he swallowed hard, "she's all I have left of Jessica. She's my purpose, my reason for everything. And these past few months, I've been so focused on building something with you that I almost forgot. I can't risk her stability for my happiness." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. She'd known this conversation might come, had feared it in her quietest moments, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like drowning. "You think loving me is a risk to Lily?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. David finally looked at her, and she could see the war happening behind his eyes. "I think loving anyone is a risk when you're responsible for someone else's entire world. Lily's already lost one mother. What happens if this doesn't work out between us? What happens if she gets attached and then loses you too?" The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. Here was David, trying to protect his daughter from the kind of loss that had already shaped Sarah's life in devastating ways. She understood his fear because she'd lived its reality. The way sudden loss could rewrite your entire understanding of safety and permanence. "So you're ending this before it can hurt her," Sarah said, not asking but stating. "I'm ending this because I have to put her first," David replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching a neighbor's cat pick its way carefully across the street. When she spoke, her voice carried the strength she'd learned to find in her darkest moments. "You're right," she said, and David's head snapped up in surprise. "Love is a risk. Caring about someone means opening yourself to loss. I know that better than most people." She turned to face him fully. "But David, not loving is a risk too. It's a guarantee of a different kind of loss. The loss of joy, of connection, of becoming the fullest version of yourself." She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. "I was going to give this to you tonight, but maybe now is the right time." Inside was a single sheet of paper, legal documents transferring a significant portion of her Tech Vision stock into a trust fund for Lily's future. "This isn't about buying my way into your family," Sarah said as David stared at the papers with wide eyes. "It's about showing you that I'm not going anywhere. When you love someone, really love them, you don't hedge your bets or keep exit strategies. You commit completely." David's hands shook as he held the documents. The financial implications were staggering, but the emotional statement was even more profound. Sarah was offering not just her heart, but her security, her future, her faith in the permanence of what they were building together. "Lily needs to know that love can be safe," Sarah continued, "that people can stay, that choosing to care about someone isn't always a prelude to loss. She needs to see that her father is brave enough to choose love even when it's scary, especially when it's scary." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decisions that would reshape not just their lives, but Lily's understanding of what love could look like. David stared at the trust documents, then at Sarah's face, seeing in her expression the kind of certainty that could anchor a family through any storm. When he finally kissed her, it tasted like salt from tears neither had realized they were crying, and like the promise of tomorrows they were finally brave enough to believe in. The next morning, Lily woke up to find Sarah making pancakes in their kitchen, humming unconsciously while she worked, looking for all the world like she belonged there. And for the first time since her mother's death, Lily allowed herself to believe that some people actually stayed. Love, they discovered, wasn't just about finding each other. It was about choosing each other, every day, especially when that choice required the kind of courage that could transform fear into faith and uncertainty into the most beautiful kind of hope.